The new Talk Radio 1210 WPHT.
How were you becoming aware of that? We talk about that all the time in talk radio. A lot of the folks here tonight are teachers. You've met some of them, etc. They know about that. How did you become aware of it?
Well, first of all, St. Anthony's College, which was where I was housed, they're all foreign affairs students. And whether you were from Italy or Russia or Germany or wherever, all of the scholars said to me, "Why are you doing this in the US? Why don't you do it in Europe? We need it." And I thought you were doing it right and we were doing it wrong. And it turns out that everyone is doing it wrong. And so I began to pay attention. I was already a member of the Constitution Center board, and so it wasn't difficult to find out what was happening in public schools. But I didn't realize the rate that it was going. And then life happened. The First War ended. The Second War began. Neither of them were legal. Neither of them followed the law. And office holders were asking everyone to not even pay attention to the wars, just go about your business and act as if nothing was happening. And there was something awfully wrong-headed about that. And there was a wrong-headed sense of a lack of common sense. Common sense was anything but common, and we were overtaken by common senselessness. And it starts with the war on terror, which is actually saying a war on a flanking movement or a war on a stirrup. It tells you nothing except that terror is a tactic of war. That's what it is. And it doesn't explain who we're at war with or why. And if you're going to have a headline, you should at least have that headline reflect some common sense way of saying who we're at war with. And there was never a question of anyone saying there was no time to go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war, which is mandated in the Constitution.
So you felt a lot of the roots of this were citizenship wasn't being practiced, we weren't proactive, and that certainly students weren't getting any of that.
I knew that there was no gene ever to be discovered that gives Americans a leg up on running a Republican democracy, and that it was a learned thing. And if you got on an airplane where you heard the announcement, "We're going to pick our pilot from business class today," you'd get off that plane. And if you heard the AMA say, "We've decided not to vet doctors anymore, and our new phrase is, if you want to be a neurosurgeon, go ahead, be a neurosurgeon," you wouldn't let that guy touch you. And citizenship is more complex than either being a doctor or a pilot or an Indian chief. And no one seemed to care. There seemed to be an extraordinary ability to ignore the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is that we were raised to believe that we lived in a revolutionary doctrine, that the ruler and the ruled could be one thing, which was a complete departure from 13,000 years of history, and that it was a noble and extraordinary act. And if we were a European power, we would have been slaughtered to the last man for trying any such thing. And yet people completely ignored the fact that they were the final arbiters of political power, didn't mind not being taught a damn thing about how to be sovereign.
How to be good citizens, right, exactly. We are going to take some questions for Richard now that we've kind of set up a little bit of his thinking, where this came from. Gentleman right over there where the microphone is, you can line up with them. We'll take some questions momentarily here because we want to know what you're thinking about the Dreyfuss Initiative. civics in the schools, the Constitution, and some of the things that Richard Dreyfuss has laid out. Scott Faulkner, who's Richard's executive director. Scott, you came upon this. How did you meet with Richard, and how did you help to move the Dreyfuss Initiative to where it is now that we're going to hear some pretty major announcements tonight later on?
Well, I'm very active in historic preservation, and Richard is on a number of boards and advises many historic preservation groups. And so we met through the Journey Through Hallowed Ground, which for some of you who may not know, is a partnership of historic sites from Gettysburg to Monticello, developing historic tourism, and I'm one of the trustees. So actually a year ago, we met at one of the annual meetings and started talking about the need for understanding history and the context of our history, and as Richard likes to say, not only who we are, but why we are. And so with that, we started dialoguing, and last fall I came on board as the executive director. My background, as Don mentioned briefly, I was Reagan's director of personnel in '80, oversaw his transition in '80-'81, was part of the White House staff, part of the White executive branch for all 8 years of Reagan. Then I was in the private sector, but then came back under Newt Gingrich to become the first chief administrative officer of the House of Representatives. And so has actually been part of two major conservative revolutions, saying what they actually could do, but also how they both fell short. And so my interest in history is long-standing, and as I finished with my tour of duty in Congress, I was focusing deeper and deeper into historic preservation, and our paths crossed. But also to bring up, why do we have a civics crisis in America? When I was CAO of the House, I met with George White many times. He was the architect of the Capitol. And the two of us in the summer of '96 planned the National Capitol Visitor Center. And this is a little bit about crowd control. This is still years before 9/11 and security concerns. The main reason for the National Capitol Visitor Center were that the tour guides of the Capitol were tired of answering tourist questions about, no, the Oval Office is not here, and also trying to explain why there were two wings to the building. And so we started to realize that whether it was tourists from Virginia or Iowa or California, there was a fundamental misunderstanding of our federal government, our Republican democracy, the three branches of government, and something had to be done. So that was my first aha moment. So when Richard asked me to come on board to help ramp up the initiative and be kind of the implementer for his great vision, I hesitated maybe a nanosecond.
The new Talk Radio 1210 WPHT.